Yeah, so this is the first of, I think, two parts uh, commentary on the topic of the media. And so basically, the first part will be just anecdotal, uh, why I'm interested. I've had a lifelong interest in the media, so that will be the first part. And the second part will be um, a kind of history of, yeah, the mass media and my specific interest in the 24-hour news cycle and so on. So, yeah, so let's start with the anecdotes. Well, I've had an interest in the media since an early age. I'll start with a few anecdotal memories. When I was about 14 in Belfast, I remember getting really upset with the television in those days, which was, of course, in black and white. And the news one night was interviewing the then Prime Minister of the UK, Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister, the Labour Prime Minister. And I was constantly hearing this word society being used. Society. I can still remember his accent. And I didn't understand what society was. In fact, I still don't think I really understand what society means. It certainly means different things to different people. When talking about society, it would be hard anyway not to mention the mass media as a factor in the discussion. That's for sure. So the next memory I have was in high school when I was about the same age, I'd say. And my English teacher had the unenviable task of teaching English to us boys. The English book had a series of essays on current affairs and sociology and politics. Now, not many of us were interested. We were only 14. But I was captivated, I remember, by one extract from a book by George Orwell called 1984, which of course was a classic. It's actually written in 1947, but the title of the book was 1984, and so the title of my memory was, or the time of my memory would have been about 1967, I'd say, 66 maybe. Yeah, so about 1966, and the essay was written by Orwell. I was so incensed by this concept of Big Brother, I remember. The state watching my every movement and monitoring my thoughts. And I was so angry that I pocketed a piece of chalk from school and I went home and I wrote on the telegraph pole outside my house with the chalk, Big Brother is watching you. And this was written on the telegraph poles because in those days the telephone lines, we had wooden telephone poles outside the houses, and they're all gone now. And I remember the guilt I felt that doing this in public in front of my neighbors, but I couldn't stop myself. Big Brother is watching you. And I made sure that the neighbors didn't see me do it. So the next anecdote to do with the mass media was, happened a few years later, 1970, when I was about 17 or 18. And I started reading seriously things. And I remember I read a book by Marshall McLuhan called Understanding Media, in which he said that the medium, the medium in which the message is delivered, is actually more important than the content of the message itself. he was the first to make me reflect on this very important fact. He was right, of course. I reflected about schools and universities where everybody sits in classrooms in rows, rather like in a military school, with a teacher at the front giving the students the information, the students are the receptacles who receive the information. This medium arrangement resembles the army for sure. The students are like soldiers, and in fact the comparison doesn't stop there. Just like the army, if you get the answer wrong at school, you get punished. If you march out of step by getting the wrong answer, you get punished. The school, as a medium, is a powerful message, more important than the content of what is taught. What is taught in a school is that learning is passive, and what is taught, above all, is conformity. Critical thinking is discouraged in schools by the medium itself, not just by the content. Here are 3 further examples of the medium is the message, which I got, because I'm lazy, I got ChatGPT to give them to me. So, for example, they give the example of television versus radio news. McLuhan argued that the medium through which news is delivered significantly impacts how the news is perceived. For example, television news broadcasts often rely heavily on visual elements, images, photos, video clips, graphics, and this all influences the emotional impact and perceived importance of the news, regardless of the actual content. In contrast, radio news doesn't have any of these things. It's an auditory medium, and it focuses more on language and sound, so which creates a different emotional and cognitive experience for the audience. Yes, very good point. Thank you, ChatGPT. And then print versus digital books. Well, yeah, of course, the medium of a book, whether it's print or digital, affects how the content is consumed and understood. Print books offer a tactile experience, allowing readers to physically interact with text, flip through pages, annotate, pencil. Digital books, on the other hand, offer only convenience and accessibility. But they can introduce also distractions and a different reading experience due to the nature of screens and hyperlinks. This difference in the medium can influence how the readers engage with and remember the information from the book. Again, it's the medium as the message, not the content. Social media, traditional communication. Well, here's another example of how the medium is the message. The medium of communication on a platform like Twitter or Facebook shapes how the messages are conveyed and received. They encourage short, concise messages, immediate reactions, lead to a rapid exchange of information, but also superficial engagement and the spread of misinformation at times. In contrast, traditional forms of communication, such as face-to-face or letters, allow for more nuanced and in-depth exchanges, fostering deeper understanding and deeper relationships. Thank you again, ChatGPT, for that. So in each of these examples, the medium itself, the way information is presented, affect how the message is perceived and understood and responded to, demonstrating McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message. I actually think my own example of schools is just as powerful as any of those that ChatGPT has produced here. Around the same time, another anecdote. When I was about 18, I read The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard. Now, here's what ChatGPT says about The Hidden Persuaders. Again, I'm too lazy to write it myself, but I could. Packard explores the techniques used by marketers to influence consumer behavior. 3 examples. Subliminal advertising. One of the most controversial techniques is this: subliminal advertising, where messages are presented in such a way that they are not consciously perceived by the viewer or the listener. This is in fact quite controversial. These messages are believed to influence behavior without the individual being aware of it. Subliminal advertising has raised ethical concerns. One example is the use of hidden images or messages in advertisements that are displayed for such a short duration or in such a subtle way that viewers are not actually conscious of them. For example, in 1957, a famous market researcher named James Vickery claimed to have increased the sales of popcorn and Coca-Cola at a cinema by flashing messages like "drink Coca-Cola" and "eat popcorn" for milliseconds during the film. Now, there is some debate about the effectiveness of subliminal advertising, but it's often cited as one of the most famous instances of attempting to influence consumer behavior. Another way in which consumer behavior can be influenced is through brand positioning. Marketers often use brand positioning to associate their products with a particular life, style, or image. By creating a strong brand image and aligning it with desirable traits or values, marketers can persuade consumers to purchase their products as a way to express their identity or belong to a certain group. Associating cigarette smoking or alcohol with sport is a classic example. This has now been banned in many countries, but not in many others. And then another way in which consumer behavior can be influenced is through appeals to fear and anxiety. This is a favorite of mine in advertising. Highlighting potential risks or negative consequences of not using a product. Marketers can then create a sense of urgency or anxiety or fear in consumers, motivating them to take action, to purchase the product, to alleviate their fears. When you go for a routine eye test, you are sometimes sold tests for all sorts of things which you have no symptoms of, like glaucoma, for example. They're just trying to sell you some other product, and there's no reason for it at all. They're just appealing to your anxiety and your fear. In fact, in my case, this is exactly what happened to me. I went for a routine eye test. The next thing I was doing, they were testing me for glaucoma and various other things, cataracts. And then the next thing, they were sending me to the hospital to have tests. And I went to the hospital for tests. And then they said, "Oh, well, would you like to be part of a research project into this?" And 4 years later, I'm still going for these tests for glaucoma and such, but there's no evidence that there's any glaucoma at all. It's just a research project. So they're all marketing. It's all started from going for a routine eye test. Now, other examples of products marketed in the Hidden Persuaders. This was a very influential book on me. Automobiles. Well, car manufacturers often use fear appeals in their advertising to emphasize safety features of their vehicles. Ads, advertisements highlight the danger of driving without certain features such as seat belts or airbags, and suggest that purchasing their cars would provide protection for the driver and passengers. Insurance companies use the same appeals to fear, highlight potential risks and consequences of not having adequate insurance. Advertisements would often depict scenarios of accidents or illness or other unforeseen events, suggesting that the purchasing of insurance could provide peace of mind and financial security. And then health products, of course. Vitamins, supplements, hygiene products, they're all marketed using fear. Appeals to fear to emphasize the risks of not using their products. My next anecdote happened when I was about 20. My friend and I were returning from a visit from Dublin University to my home in Belfast. My friend was driving, and I remember discussing with him the problem of the mass media. He was an artist, my friend, and a very talented one. And we're discussing art, and I was not an artist and couldn't paint or do anything. But he insisted that anybody could do art, make art. Well, encouraged by this, I said, well, I wanted to make a piece of art on the theme of the mass media. And we both had agreed that the problem was the mass media had too much power. They were bombarding us with television, radio, and newspaper images every day in the form of advertisements. There was no internet at this time, by the way. So my suggestion was, I suggested getting a plastic skull of a human being and covering it with newspaper cuttings. This was to be my contribution to art. And my friend said, but it has to be beautiful. Beautiful. Oh, I thought, how do I do that? I hadn't thought about the beauty thing. Anyway, my final anecdote to do with the mass media refers to a conversation I heard on the television about, I think, 15 to 20 years ago. Some reporter was interviewing a Guatemalan peasant who was a community leader in an obscure little small town or village somewhere in rural Guatemala. The peasant was saying that there are two versions of every place in the world. There is the real lived experience version, and there is the media version, the image portrayed by the media. I remember thinking how true that was. Almost every place I have lived in, Ghana, Colombia, Malawi, Manchester, Belfast, they have all had a different lived experience to the one expected from the media image. In Ghana, the media image everyone told me it would be a dangerous place from a security point of view. Not at all. It was completely the opposite. It was the very safest place I had ever lived in. In Manchester, I was expecting it to be safe. But no, I felt insecure walking on the streets at night, especially at the hour when the pubs closed. When I told people living in Belfast, when I told people, that I had lived in Belfast, and people replied, they expressed surprise at, oh, how had you survived the bombs and bullets? Well, of course, I'd never seen a bomb go off or seen a bullet fired. For me, my lived experience of Belfast was like that of any other British city. In Cali, Colombia, we were told that there was insecurity everywhere. But when we arrived, our lived experience was that we felt completely safe for the 2 years that we were there. And in fact, to emphasize the point, I would have to say that today, in 2024, I would be reluctant to go back to Colombia because I still believe this media image of a violent, insecure country, even though my lived experience told me it was not true 40 years ago. Such is the power of the media image. In all these cases, the media image was or is false. Why? Because the media always tries to frighten the audience. People are okay with being frightened. It's like watching a horror movie. As long as the frightening takes place in some place that's far away from the listener. So, at this point, I'm going to end, I think, the first part of my thing on the media here. And in a second, I'm going to briefly look at the history of the mass media and focus on the 24-hour news cycle, my nemesis.